delighted to have with me two fantastic industry leaders. First of all, Meri Rosich of Standard Charter CCIB. Hi, Meri.
Thank you. Hello.
And Alexander Galt from IKEA Group.
Hey.
Hi, Alex. First of all, I'd like to introduce Meri, who's the Chief Data Officer at Standard Chartered CCIB. Meri leads a team of data scientists, AI practitioners, and data engineers focused on transforming businesses with the strategic use of data. I can only touch on some of Meri's career achievements here, but she's lived in 6 countries, headed up global teams for Visa, Amex, Bertelsmann, Samsung, and Docomo, and recently has spent the last 15 years across Asia, from in Hong Kong, Tokyo, and most recently and today from Singapore, where she joins us. You can check out Meri's profile on the speaker info page and on LinkedIn, and I'm sure she'll welcome connections from people joining the event. Now, Alexander has a job title that Meri might be a little bit envious of. Alex is the digital ethics leader for the IKEA Group, with responsibility to develop digital ethics practices across the whole IKEA value chain. Alex started working on digital ethics when he was a data scientist for public health in the UK and utilising the UK government data ethics framework. Then, as part of his postgraduate work, he developed digital data ethics practice within Deloitte in the Netherlands. Now, we've only got half an hour, so I'm going to dive straight in and ask Meri a key question. What do you see as the kind of the key opportunities for sharing data in industry?
Thank you, Stuart. It's a pleasure to be here. We know that businesses are data stewards, and we follow practices that ensure that the data is accessible, data is safe, and it's trusted. And businesses are starting to recognize the value of the data as part of an ecosystem, not just as part of silos. And I love when Nigel said that data, when it's locked, is just occupying space in cloud and systems, but it really needs to be shared with purpose. And I think in Asia, we are seeing an increase in government-led trusted data sharing frameworks. For example, Australia has published the best practice guide to applying data sharing principles. Singapore also published the Singapore Trusted Data Sharing Frameworks. Philippines, India, as well as at regional level, many others have published data management and governance frameworks. So we see the importance of fostering trust in data ecosystems as a whole to solve really big challenges, such as cybersecurity as a whole ecosystem, but also to promote collaboration between the private sector, research communities, and NGOs to solve the big challenges of the future.
Thanks, Meri. I'd like to come back to some of the collaboration opportunities in a bit. But before I do, Alex, from your perspective, what can businesses be doing to steward data more responsibly?
Yeah, good question. And I can echo what Meri and Nigel have said. I think it's about seeing data not just from a business value perspective. Of course, we sit on data, and the initial side of it is seeing data as an asset and seeing that you need to break down these internal silos, but also to see not just the business value, but the whole value side of things. How can we solve big environmental challenges or societal challenges with data that we all sit on? And I think from IKEA's perspective, we are led by our culture and values. We have the many people at heart, and the whole idea to make or create a better everyday life for the many people. And data is part of that. People are creating data about themselves more and more. Life is becoming more digitalized. So we need to see that there is value from individuals to create value for themselves, not just for businesses to create value on top of that. But I think the other side of it is not just to see it as a personal data side of things. We sit on lots of business data that can help solve challenges like supply chain optimization and make that more environmental. So we need to see these large movements within society and get on board.
Okay, well, that's great to reference some of those examples from across different parts of different sectors. Kind of brings me back to the point that Meri made a second ago. Meri, you talked about cross-sector collaboration opportunities. Can you give some examples of things you've seen going on in and across the industry you've worked in. I mean, you've worked across multiple sectors, obviously at the moment kind of in financial services, but in telco and other sectors. Can you just give some concrete examples of things you've seen happening?
Sure, there are lots of really fascinating cases, and I think the reason for that is that governments and organizations, NGOs, they are pursuing these data sharing initiatives because they can create significant value by solving these problems. And I think we need to recognize that any one institution cannot solve these problems on their own. We only hold our own view of the problem. But when we collaborate, when we work together, then we can solve bigger things. A few examples, the health industry has seen research around COVID to help diagnose and treat the pandemics. The COVID-19 Clinical Research Coalition connected data from all over the world and helped, resource-limited jurisdictions that couldn't really cope with the research. When we look at the private sector, look at just recent acquisitions as well. IBM, for example, bought the weather company that had massive amounts of data, and then combining that with predictive modeling systems, they have a really powerful forecasting system for data that can then promote environmental sustainability and prevent weather emergencies. Another example from Asia is, for example, by publishing data with purpose, is a climate data sharing partnership in New Zealand, where they initiated support from the government plans to create and to foster more greater action for climate change. So there are lots of initiatives that we can see that are starting to really bring real value to the table.
Thank you. I mean, that's some great examples of things I certainly hadn't come across, found very interesting. Alex, you talked about cultural values earlier. Obviously, IKEA is pretty well known for having strong, upbeat Scandinavian cultural values. How do you embed those into data stewardship and a new generation of data stewardship?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to some tangible practices as well. And just before this, I was reading the recent report that's come out from the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, which was a lot of survey data on why people are willing to share data and under what circumstances. And one of the main ones that's come out from that is that it's all about trust. You have to trust the organization that holds your data and who wants to share it. And also why. If we're just doing data sharing or using data for our own business benefit, that isn't as well received as taking it to wider benefit. The other side of it was the tangible governance mechanisms that people can see and engage with, and data institutions being one of those where you set up legal frameworks or institutional frameworks to see how your data is being held, who it's being used by, and for what purposes. I think these are some of the measures that we can look to, and that we'll hear a lot more about later on in the event, to see how we can engage in this and show real tangible benefits for people and tangible ways that they can engage with it. And I think businesses like ours can look to these, mainly startups, I think, and see how we get involved with them.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we talked specifically about businesses, but I mean, at the top of every business, there's a leader, be it a chief executive, or depending on the kind of structure of that business, a collection of leaders running the show. What should responsible data stewardship look like for the business leaders of today and tomorrow? Meri.
I think when we look at leadership, I think in our organization we are very lucky. There's very strong awareness and really deep thought around what that role of data is in leadership. Sometimes I'm a little bit more concerned when I see in some organizations when people talk about data is the oil, is the new oil, and they try to look at data in terms of that scarce resource. We like to think of data more like water, because it's a critical resource. It's part of an ecosystem. It needs to flow between clouds and lakes and different parts of the ecosystem to generate value. And it's such a critical resource that we need to invest in making sure that the data is clean for consumption, pretty much like water, that it drives the right outcomes. And this is why leaders need to look at promoting the right fit for purpose infrastructure systems and ensuring that the intellectual property is also very well managed and maintained. So I think I always worry when I hear a little bit about the narrative of oil. I think we need to promote water. And it was very interesting to hear about Nigel talk about, the water passages and the cleanliness of water. I think it's pretty much the same when we talk about oil, and making sure that we make a very strong call to action as leaders on how important it is, how critical it is, and that we continue to invest in not just the risk side of it, but also the value and the opportunities that it can generate for the ecosystem.
Thank you. And yes, I think it has been timely to consider it in the context of water. I mean, and we at the Open Data Institute are passionate about getting people to see data and consider it in the same way they consider critical infrastructure. So I think those two messages are ones we want to echo. What about from your side, Alex? I mean, you've worked across public, private sector. I mean, IKEA is a collection of franchise organizations. How do you, across perhaps what might be a kind of almost like a federated business model, how do you get leaders to align to work the same way, and what could or should a responsible approach to data look like for leaders across multiple businesses?
No, I think it's realizing that the world exists beyond your own silo and that we all gain benefit from it. And I love this idea of, and I'm very warned off the idea of data as oil. I think we create the wrong incentives when we start to talk about things like data as oil, and that is, we should be captive of it, and we should be keeping it for ourselves and monetizing it and all of these things. We need to create the different incentive structures, and some of that is the language around it. How do we see data and see it more as a common good? When it comes to complex organizations, I think setting a direction that we all want to achieve and that we all see the wider benefit. Like I said, trust is the big thing which will enable us to continue to innovate, and for people to be willing to share their data with us and to use that in innovative ways, and to do analytics and all these things that the business wants to see and use and get better business value from. We're not going to be able to do that running into the future if we don't have trust. So I think building up those trusted relationships, looking at it as a long-term relationship with our customers, with our co-workers, is the only way that we're going to be able to do this.
Well, I think we've probably kind of done the water analogy to a decent extent. We've certainly got some endorsements from the audience. We've got people commenting that keeping the data pure, purity is key, is a comment from one audience member. And someone else, Eric Sutherland, I'm sure won't mind me quoting him, saying he likes to talk about digital as pipes and data as water that needs to be cleansed and curated. And I quite like that. So I'll probably be reusing that. Thank you, Eric. So we often talk about trust in data being key, but a question's come in and say, how do we achieve that? It's a long time in coming. I mean, the ODI is 10 years old this year. I was looking back over the last 10 years, and it's quite sad when you do look back over the last 10 years. A lot of the big news in and around data is when things have gone wrong. So how do we build trust? How do we achieve that over the next 10 years? Meri?
I think we have a lot of work to do, but the most important thing is really to encourage the right practices across organizations. We need to promote the standardization and interoperability, because it's when we can really talk to each other and connect and learn globally that we advance faster. I think interoperability and creation of standards, global taxonomies, is one of the areas where we can all invest in and work together.
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember when we spoke yesterday, just moving on from this, we talked about incentives and incentives in culture. I mean, long-term incentives. Alex, can you expand on how you think that might fit in the kind of corporate context? What are the sorts of incentives we need to create to help bring this about?
Yeah, I think the incentive is, again, I mentioned it a lot of times, back down to trust. We have responsibility, but I think people will take the wrong decisions if they don't see that this is going to enable them to do things into the future. But I think that coming back to how you build trust is then tangible examples. You can't just be esoteric and not deliver on that. and say that there's overall value. And I think there's some organizations out there that will talk about the values behind it and have good principles and all of these things, but then not demonstrate it. So I think that's the work that we have going forward. And there's a saying within IKEA that there's no better method than the good example. And this is what we need to continue to do and show is develop those good examples, make it tangible for people, because the many people, the everyday people out there are not thinking about their data all the time and what it means to them and whether it's water or oil or whatever. They're just doing what they do. So we need to make it tangible for them and show benefit to people as well.
Well, you've mentioned good examples. Just building on that point, so a few more audience questions coming in now about asking for specific examples of kind of areas of working with data. Someone said, well, putting this into practices, how should businesses and governments build trust in data collection and data usage? I think that's a quite interesting question. I know from working both in industry and government, and in different cultures, there are very varying levels of trust between the state and citizens or between consumers and businesses. Meri, what's your view? Why don't we tackle the government one? What do you think governments could or should be doing to build trust around collection of data and data usage?
So I think there's a number of governments that have published trust data sharing standards. And in these frameworks, they recommend a set of initiatives. So it could be the types of formats and the transfer mechanisms that can be standardized. Promoting APIs as the preferred mechanism, it's something that it's widely recognized, and the standardization of the processes. I think it's reasonably now well understood the set of trusting data sharing practices that governments can promote, and many of them are publishing these frameworks and doing it quite well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just not to kind of labor the water analogy, we've actually got someone that is very keen on the original ODI infrastructure reference as data being like roads infrastructure, where we kind of expanded upon the idea that you would know which side to drive on because someone's kind of developed accepted practices around that the traffic lights represent things like standards, so you know when to stop and where to stop, all these kind of things. They all apply to different forms of infrastructure. I think the principle is if we can think about data as infrastructure, that would be great. We've also got more endorsement for your comment earlier, Alex, about data as a public good coming in from Paul earlier. Thank you for that, Paul. So just kind of, we've got, hang on, there's another question. Cope data is more like happiness. It grows in value when shared. Okay, well, that is an interesting concept, and it kind of certainly goes back to some of the open data principles that we've always been keen to evangelize, having been named and founded as the Open Data Institute. The critical need for solid, trustworthy open data infrastructure from government is something we will always be standing behind. But what about businesses? I mean, that's where a lot of the challenges have been over the last 10 years, and the way businesses collect and use our data. What could businesses do, Alex, to build more trust? I mean, retail is perhaps a sector which has challenges in this area. What do you think businesses could or should be doing in this to build trust?
Yeah, I think it's about creating inspirational stories and again, living up to the principles and the promises that we put out there and saying we want to have a long-term relationship with people and their data and not to be seen to be taking advantage of that. And that happens across different parts of the relationship. But I think putting a lot more control back to individuals. We're seeing this whole shift of people understanding now what their data means to them, but not necessarily having the capability to do anything with it. So I think we need to build different ways to be able for people to realize their own value from data. But again, like I said before, it's not just about individuals and personal data. And I think even the terminology and how we get inspired around this matters. I'm really glad that we're talking about data stewardship rather than just data protection. When we talk about protection, and this is important, but we tend to put up walls and guards and frameworks and bureaucracy around it, rather than trying to find the way where we still protect the data, but we are also getting more value from it. So I think this idea of data stewardship and data institutions adds a lot more nuance around what we want to achieve with data. So I think having those stories, having that narrative, making the right metaphors, and then bringing the tangible examples. One of them that I think is really great and isn't around personal data is in the EU, there's this digital product passport. And this is where we're showing the individual products, what materials are in there. So when it comes to recycling that product or disposing of it, we know exactly what to do with it. So here it's showing the data from the supply side and the supply chain all the way through to manufacture and end use. The data around what that product is follows that product through its life, so we can enable things like circular economy. I think those simple stories of seeing how data brings that overall societal benefit are things that we need to build upon.
That's fantastic. So thank you for sharing that example. Certainly, I guess data learning from other sectors where where provenance is just considered a critical norm, be it the art sector or, for example, or other sectors. I mean, why not do the same for consumables in a much more rigorous way? That's a fantastic example. We're seeing a bit more audience engagement coming at us, actually, and we've had some appreciation that the point about trust in government is very different in different countries from Ushnish Sengupta. And it makes it very difficult to develop universal principles and solutions. And I think that is that. I mean, I'd like to expand on that into a question, actually. Meri, you've worked across different parts of Asia where some of the countries that we named in your introduction earlier, very, very different culturally. How do you tackle this? How do you bring universality to universal solutions of standards or principles to sharing data? What sort of things can you do?
So I think it's. I completely agree with the point on the chat. It's very challenging because there are different cultural approaches to data. In the same way that there are different organizational cultures, there are also different approaches to data management. And it's not just because certain entities might be regulated or not across certain data points and how data is managed or stored, but it's more around what is the perception of the value of the data. And in this sense, you will have organizations that are that have a very exploitative approach to data. And I hope that these organizations are starting to disappear. We've all seen cases in the news. There are other organizations which are purely transactional, that they will see data as an asset and they will do their best to monetize within the spirit and the letter of the law. But then you'll have organizations which are really more transformational, that really decide to generate impact with data, that they have initiatives for developing trust, helping society, really bringing back, and helping economies drive impact across the world. And these are organizations that have the data culture aligned to their values. And I see this in organizations such as, for example, Alexander IKEA is also a good example of working with data in very public case studies that look at impact in society. And I think that's why yesterday we were joking about the title. The ethics is such a great title at IKEA. I think leaders should consider what is the data culture that they want to foster in their organizations, and drive the organizational alignment, the enablers, and everything behind not just the business strategy and what are the limits of the regulatory environment that they set in, but also what is their vision around the data culture that they want to drive for the future of the ecosystem. And I think organizations that do this well are going to succeed because they're going to be very, very well placed for the future.
We've got a kind of whole bunch of questions coming in. We've got a little less than 10 minutes to go. We've got 9 minutes to go, so we're not going to get through all of them. I just want to make people aware we will take the questions, and Meri, Alex and I agreed yesterday that we will kind of put responses to them or thoughts to them after this, because we want to make sure we kind of respond to people. I want to jump in on one that I think it needs to be heard, though, and this is from Kane Chan. How should we be thinking about data and data sharing with small to medium businesses? a lot of ongoing conversations we're having are focused on governments and large corporations. It's a great point. I mean, at the end of the day, the majority of organizations across the world are small to medium enterprises. How do we make this accessible? I mean, they may not have the expertise. I mean, certainly big corporations have chief data officers, Meri, but most small companies don't, right? So if you're a small to medium-sized business, what are the sort of couple of 2 or 3 steps you might take to get involved in this and try and do it how can it be more accessible to you?
Yes, I think we should always look at the use case first. We should always think of what is the problem that we are trying to solve, right? And sharing for the sake of sharing is not going to create value. But trying to solve a problem and recognizing that you are not the only one that has this problem, and maybe somebody else has the same problem. And then we create this ecosystem where we have a use case, a very strong call to action to solve. So say any small organization involved in, say, e-commerce in any part of the world that has problems with fraud. I think it's a very important problem that can be solved as part of an ecosystem approach, potentially by sharing data of challenges that they are going through, and there are lots of initiatives around this where it's important to identify what is the problem worth solving, and then working together with everybody else who also can see the problem from a different angle.
I think that's a great point. I think small to medium businesses can group together to solve common problems, and there are means that make that a lot easier these days in the digital world than there used to be. I'm going to whiz through a couple of questions and try and, Alex, there's one that's particularly relevant for you coming up, but we've got one about from Lauren Maxwell saying, part of trust is building indicators that can be applied across sectors. What does good data sharing and reuse look like, and how has that been achieved? What happens when we don't share? Moving beyond storytelling, what do we see as indicators that can be used for benchmarking and cross comparisons? Well, we don't have all the answers. I think there's some big questions there. I will say very tactically, and a little plug for the ODI, we actually released a data ethics maturity model benchmarking tool in the last couple of days. If you go to the odi.org, I'm sure one of the team members will stick it out in the chat. In terms of working with data ethics, we've tried to provide a framework to support people to find out where they are on that journey. And we've seen huge engagement with our data ethics canvas over the last 3 or 4 years. So there are kind of free things you can make use of, but of course, it's like any kind of new area. It needs investment in time, effort, and human resources. There's a question specifically for you, Alex, from Kay Pal. Can Alex talk about cross-border cultural issues in the IKEA group with data and experiences you've got of managing these? Perhaps there's some examples you think that might be interesting for the audience.
Yeah, I think not any specific examples to go into and dive into now, because they are nuanced, as you can imagine. But I think when we're talking about ethics rather than compliance, this also comes up. So, of course, within any country that we operate, there is this minimal level of compliance. But above that, there is the IKEA culture and values. Of course, within the sort of organization we work in, that there is freedom in some ways to interpret what these values mean. But the idea that we respect human rights, that we have codes of conduct, that we have these mechanisms in place to say, and more so the attitude and the culture to say that it's not just about minimally complying with law, but really living IKEA culture and values, which is very humanistic, it's very human rights based, it's very people focused and planet focused, and to give people the confidence that when they make decisions with that values basis in mind, that they are the right decisions. That if we're not taking that opportunistic mindset of here is something that we go and do to build business value today, even though it's at the expense of or potentially at the expense of long-term relationships and long-term impact, that we are able to actually maybe make sacrifices today that will benefit us and the brand and the whole business in the long term. But of course, there's within that comes cultural nuance, and these are some of the live things that we're exploring.
Thanks, Alex, and I need to bring it to a close. I mean, we've got just a minute or so left, and I'd like to thank both of you for giving up your time today and giving your input to these fantastic questions we've had from the audience in particular. Just as a kind of closing thought, the geopolitical, environmental, and socio-economic challenges we face today are perhaps greater than they've ever been. Climate change, refugees, aging societies, global wealth divide of a magnitude we've never seen before. Data is made by us and has the potential to serve as a force for good in tackling these challenges. If we could get together and convene the leaders of the global 2000, it's the largest public companies on the planet, and ask them to do something different with data, what would our call to action be to those leaders? Meri, I'll go straight to you.
If I had the 200 top leaders of the global companies, I would ask them, do you know what the data culture of your organization is? Are you actively aligning it to your values? Do you have an understanding of what needs to happen to get to that ideal state? And maybe they would think further about where their investments are going and how to promote the right behaviors within the organization.
Thanks, Meri. That's a great answer. Alex, what about you? What do you think you would put to them?
Yeah, I think something very similar. See this as an opportunity. See it as an opportunity to demonstrate responsibility as an organization, and see it as a responsibility to look to a long-term future rather than just a short-term one. Because all the the issues that you described are ones that aren't going away anytime soon. So we need to have a long-term approach and a long-term perspective. And see that we, through small steps along the way, with tangible actions, with tangible examples, that we can actually make things better.